thank him or not. I don't want to encourage him. It's a little scary to get him on a roll. Good evening. It's certainly good to be here with you again this evening. If you open in your Bibles to John chapter 11, will be as whatever the doctor's name is. I want to, huh? Oh, okay. Yeah, I think he's unhinged maybe, but we're going to be studying from the book of John, chapter 11, the story of the recovery of Lazarus from, of course, the dead. And as we've been doing, or as I've been doing each night, as I kind of look at songs that can be theme songs, of course, I think the theme for this entire study, as far as the adult class and the attempts we've been making to lead this study, is Blessed Assurance, as we talked first night, then last night. The great physician and the role that the great physician had in the recovery of the blind man, and of course in our spiritual recovery. Tonight, as we look at and as we examine the faith that Martha had as she ran out onto the road to meet the Lord, it was obvious that her faith was tremendous. And so as a theme song, I think that we need to learn from her faith. We need to learn that our shield of faith needs to be complete. It needs to be strong, just like the shield of a soldier in the Lord's army, as we all sang, is important to be present and in front of us, before us all the time. And so our shield of faith. The song, My Faith Looks Up to Thee, page 338. I want to read the words of that. And again, sometimes we sing these songs and just we enjoy the melody, we enjoy the four-part harmony and things like that, and that's well and good, but I find myself occasionally not really dwelling on the words. And so during our song practice emphasis night once a month, I will just occasionally read the words to a song. And, I think it sort of helps us to refocus a little bit on what we're saying. So page 338, I'd like to read the words of this song, My Faith Looks Up to Thee. And I think it certainly will help us to come away tonight with the important message that our faith is, without faith it's impossible to please God. And so we need to work to constantly build our faith up, to make our faith what it should be, so that we can have the faith that Martha had in Jesus and his abilities and his powers. And so the words of this song, I think, are very appropriate. 338, My Faith Looks Up to Thee. My faith looks up to Thee, Thou Lamb of Calvary, Savior divine. Now hear me while I pray, take all my guilt away. Oh, let me from this day be wholly Thine. May Thy rich grace impart strength to my fainting heart, my zeal inspire. As Thou hast died for me, oh, let my love to Thee, pure, warm, and changeless, be a living fire. When life's dark maze I tread, and griefs around me spread, be Thou my guide. Bid darkness turn today, wipe sorrow's tears away, nor let me ever stray from Thee aside. When ends life's transit dream, when death's cold sullen stream shall o'er me roll, blessed Savior, then in love, fear and distrust remove, oh, bear me safe above a ransomed soul. And so from the words of that song, as we sing it in the future, hopefully it will help to focus our minds on the role that God expects us to build our faith, the role that faith has in our Christianity and our eventual salvation, because without the hope that we will be, as Lazarus was resurrected from the dead, we'll be facing that resurrection as well. Whether we have faith in God or not, all all eyes will see when the second coming occurs. So let's look, the story of Lazarus and his being raised from the dead is an interesting one, and I can find plenty of science in this lesson, and I'm going to be careful not to veer off too much into science tonight, because there's some, when you start thinking about the miracle of somebody being raised from the dead, and you start thinking about what that entails, it's just staggering. It's mind-blowing to imagine what Jesus had to do to bring Lazarus back to life. And so, as we've done the last couple nights, we want to read and again, there are 57 verses in this chapter, and I'm going to sort of break it down into sections because it sort of fits that way as we discuss the various aspects of the story of the Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. Beginning in John chapter 11, verse 1 through 16. Now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and his sister Martha. It was that Mary who anointed the Lord with fragrant oils and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. Therefore the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. When Jesus heard that, he said, This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was sick, he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. Then after this he said to his disciples, Let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, lately the Jews sought to stone you, and are you going there again? Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if one walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. These things he said, and after that he said to them, Our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I may wake him up. Then his disciples said, Lord, if he sleeps, he will get well. However, Jesus spoke of his death, but they thought that he was speaking about taking rest in sleep. Then Jesus said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead. And I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to him. Then Thomas, who is called Didymus, said to his fellow disciples, Let us also go, that we may die with him. And so we see that as this story is introduced by the Apostle John, we see the connection that Jesus had with this family of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Now we have very sketchy or very limited information. We can draw some possible inferences about this particular family. There are a couple things we know absolute. One thing that is stated in the first 16 verses is that this was a family of individuals that Jesus loved. He had high regard for these individuals. It appears that Martha may have been the head of the household, or sort of and some of the commentators made the point that, sometimes in this part of the world and the culture at this time, that women weren't always thought of as being very important, but it appears that, what they did for a living, how they acquired the house that they had, but they were obviously very generous with Jesus and his disciples as they traveled, as they came and stayed with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. So it's a very interesting dynamic that Jesus had with these individuals. And Mary and Martha seemed to sort of roll out the red carpet, as it was, for Jesus and his followers as they traveled. And we know of at least 3 times that Jesus visited the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And so an interesting dynamic must have developed with this family and Jesus. Obviously, he was there enough that they became more than just acquaintances. They became loved ones. And again, we think of, and we should think of Christians as our family. And if you've never had the opportunity to travel and to have the opportunity to make the acquaintance of saints in other places, it is a phenomenal feeling to be, I've been clear across the country and contact a local church, a Lord's church, and say, I want to come to services tonight. Well, can we come and get you? Where are you at? And in one case, I was about 1.5 miles away. I said, I'll walk. I've got a couple hours before services, and I'd like to see a little bit of the area. And the gentleman who I spoke to said, well, if you get tired on the way, you call me and I'll come pick you up. He took me home back to my hotel later that night. And even clear across the world, I was in London, flying to London, and had made arrangements with a congregation there to speak on Christian evidences. And I said, well, I'll catch the bus into the city where you are. And he said, no, you won't. He said, I'll be at the airport. I'll be at Heathrow Airport. And he said, how will I know you? And I said, well, I'll wear a West Virginia baseball cap. And so I went through customs, and huge receiving area at the Heathrow Airport, and hundreds, maybe thousands of people coming off of planes from all over the world. And I come out into this large area where people are waiting for arrivals, and I heard, hey, Dave, clear across the place. And I said, I'll probably be sticking up about 10 inches or 12 inches above everybody. And it was just like immediately we were family. And so if you've never had that opportunity to have family around the world and to realize that it's our commonality, our common faith that makes us family, and that bond of family is so much greater than the physical earthly bonds. Those earthly bonds are important. They're, hopefully they can be in Christ as well as in the flesh, but certainly the physical or the spiritual bond holds a much greater importance than the physical bonds of this life. But so we see that Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were people that Jesus greatly respected. And at this point, we see that Lazarus, one of the commentators made the point, and I hadn't really thought about it. You think of somebody getting sick and dying. I don't know about you, but I think of me, old people. I think of folks that are elderly, that are on in years. But one of the commentators say, well, that may not necessarily have been the case. That they may have been younger than Jesus and may have been in their early 20s and 30s. And you say, well, how'd they acquire a house and all of these things? So there's just so many questions that we don't know, but obviously we know that their generosity, their hospitality to Jesus and his disciples made them very close to Jesus. And so when Lazarus got sick, Mary and Martha sent a message to Jesus. Again, were they familiar with his healing the blind man, healing the man that was paralyzed, as in Sunday night and Monday night's lesson? We figure that probably they had heard about it. If it did not occur in their area, the word spread about these miracles that Jesus had done. And so Mary and Martha said, let's get Jesus over here. If Jesus comes, Lazarus can be healed. He can be made better. And so we see that they sent for Jesus, but interestingly enough, Jesus delayed his leaving, his going to be with Lazarus. And of course, we know there was a goal in that. The disciples didn't understand. Mary and Martha didn't understand. Jesus, why didn't you arrive sooner? If you'd have been here, our brother would not have died. And so we see that Jesus again, and very plainly, in the first 16 verses, Jesus says there was a reason for delaying. Of course, the disciples thought, well, we need to go now. But Jesus stayed in verse 6 2 more days. Of course, Jesus and his ability to know everything. He was the Son of God. He was the Son of God. He was God, and he knew exactly how sick Lazarus was. He knew exactly when Lazarus died. And yet he wanted to make sure he tarried where he was for 2 days. And then again, they just didn't go out and hop in a car and do 60 miles an hour down the road, and be there in 25, 30 minutes or an hour or 2 hours. They were on foot. They were walking. And so we know that it took them some time to arrive. And by the time they got there, of course, Jesus had died. His disciples tried to warn him. You don't want to go back to Bethany. Bethany was a little town about 2 miles outside of Jerusalem, sort of a little village, and probably a lot of people lived in Bethany and went to Jerusalem maybe for conduct business and work. It's about like Beelington is with Bridgeport and Clarksburg. People live in Beelington and drive to Bridgeport to work and things like that. And so Bethany was sort of a suburb of the city of Jerusalem. And we know that Jesus, matter of fact, when he went for the last week of his life, his triumphal entry in Jerusalem started at Bethany, probably at the house of Martha and Lazarus, where he probably stayed. Matter of fact, we know he went back there a couple nights during his last week of his life. And so the disciples said, Lord, if you go back there, remember what happened the last time you were there? They tried to stone you. If you go back into John chapter 10, verse 31 through 39, we see this account where it says, Then the Jews took up stones again to stone him. And Jesus answered them, Many good works have I shown you from my Father. For which of those works do you stone me? The Jews answered him, saying, For a good work we do not stone you, but for blasphemy, and because you, being a man, make yourself God. Then Jesus answered them, Is it not written in your law, I said, you are gods? If he called them gods, to whom the word of God came, and the scripture cannot be broken, do you say of him whom the Father sanctified and sent into the world, You are blaspheming because I said, I am the Son of God? If I do not do the works of my Father, do not believe me. But if I do, though you do not believe me, believe the works, that you may know and believe that the Father is in me and I in him. Therefore they sought again to seize him, but he escaped out of their hands. We know on several occasions that Jesus not only showed his ultimate supreme divine power by his miracles, by his healing people, but he also had the ability, apparently, to disappear. Because on multiple occasions, a mob of people were ready to capture him. He was in the midst of, a mob. And it says Jesus just walked out from among them. Well, if you're in the middle of a mob, I doubt that you just walk away without somebody noticing. All right, and here's another example of that where Jesus, in verse 39, they sought to seize him. He just escaped out of their hands. Again, I believe that would have been a miraculous escape because he didn't whip out his sword and start, fighting them off. He just left. And so we see the miraculous, the power of Jesus in these things. But it was the disciples who were pointing out to Jesus, well, if you go back there, the Jews are going to know you're there, and the Jews are going to try to stone you again. They'll try to capture you again. And of course, Jesus knew that. He knew that possibly could happen, and of course, but he also knew what was going to happen when he got there, having foreknowledge, being able to know what was going to happen. And so he said, well, Lazarus is asleep, and we're going to go to him. And his disciples, well, wait a minute, Lord, if Lazarus is just asleep, if he's just resting, he'll get better, he'll wake up. And of course, Jesus had to explain to them again, not, these disciples as they're trying to come to grips with who Jesus was, with what his mission was, with what their purpose was as his disciples, had much to learn. We have the benefit of seeing the beginning of Jesus' life, reading through the story of his ministry, and to see the end of the story. The disciples didn't have that advantage. And so we certainly have so much more than they had. So we see their humanity. They're struggling with trying to understand what's going on. And so Jesus said, he's asleep, but then he had to plainly tell him he's dead. Lazarus has died, but we're going to go to him anyway. And we see there in verse 16 that Thomas, doubting Thomas, said, okay, guys, if he's going back to Bethany, he's probably going to die. Let's go with him and die too. And so we see the commitment of Thomas in this case, and apparently the other disciples agreed and went along. And so we see that Jesus now makes his way back to the town of Bethany, the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, where Lazarus has died. He has expired at whatever age he was. And of course, it would even be more tragic if he were a younger man. Again, we think, well, if somebody's elderly in life, they've lived a full life, but if Lazarus was a younger man, then it would have made it that much more tragic. And so an interesting, something to think about. Let's pick up in verse 17 and read down to verse 27 as we continue with this story. So when Jesus came, he found that he had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles away. And many of the Jews had joined the women around Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. Then Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went and met him. But Mary was sitting in the house. Then Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And whosoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who has come into the world. And so we see this encounter. Of course, we know that Mary and Martha, on one other occasion that Jesus was there, Martha was busy about being the host. She was preparing food for their travelers, which was the hospitable thing to do. Of course, Mary, on the other hand, wanted to sit at the feet of Jesus and learn from the wisdom that Jesus could impart. Of course, we know that normally wouldn't have been one of the things that a woman was supposed to do. Again, women many times were sort of pushed to the side, almost the servants and things like that. And of course, Martha was upset with Mary because she wasn't helping her prepare the food for the guests that they were entertaining on that particular occasion. And of course, Martha goes to Jesus, and Jesus doesn't really condemn Martha, but he says Mary has chosen the better thing of listening to the words that I have to impart. And so we know that that there was a little bit of, I won't say jealousy, but there was some rivalry there. But we see that in this case, when Martha finds that Jesus is on his way, she runs out to meet him. She goes first. Mary stays at the house and does not, at this point, interact with Jesus. And it's Martha who first comes to this situation and says, Lord, if you had been here, Lazarus would be alive. She had faith that Jesus could keep him from dying. So her faith was strong to begin with. But, again, and that's probably, if Jesus had just healed his illness, kept him from dying, that would not have shown as much power, would not have allowed Jesus to teach about the resurrection from the dead, which obviously he had done, or Martha would not have known. Okay, because Jesus says in verse 23, your brother's going to rise again. Martha quickly turns around and says, yeah, I know, Lord, I know about the resurrection from the dead. I know that he'll arise at the resurrection to the last day. So Jesus had Martha had learned the lessons. We think, well, Mary probably knew more about the teachings of Jesus because she sat at his feet, in one of the visits. But it appears that Martha as well learned the lessons that Jesus was teaching about the resurrection from the dead, and that everyone would see Jesus. Everyone would be raised from the dead in the last day. Of course, Jesus wanted to, re-emphasize that, and we see in verses 25 through 27, he asked Martha the question. 23. Oh yeah, back up, 25, yes. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And whosoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? And of course, Martha here makes very similar statement, confession of faith that Peter did when Jesus asked Peter a similar question, because she says in verse 27, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who has come into the world. And so we see that Martha gives that, between Peter and Martha, those two confessions that of who Jesus was is, of course, crucial to our salvation. We have to confess that Jesus is the Son of God. And, in the plan of salvation, we list the confession of our faith, the good confession. And many times, I know as individuals are baptized into the watery grave of baptism, the individual, the man doing the baptism, either in the baptistry or before, taking their good confession, will ask them to repeat that. Ask them to repeat that they do believe that Jesus is the Son of God. And certainly we see that Martha's statement here, as well as Peter's statement, to the same effect, of course. And Jesus pointed out that the good confession that Peter made allowed him to have the keys to the kingdom of heaven. That statement of faith, that statement of belief that Jesus is the Son of God. And that's the same confession that we today have to make, have to come to that point. We have to arrive by faith at the point that who Jesus is. And that only by being a follower, a believer, being obedient to his will, being obedient to the plan that he left, can we have that hope of raising from the dead, and as Jesus says, never to die again. And so we see that Martha, in this particular case, and we don't know, probably the disciples were there on the road as Jesus was walking to Bethany. When Martha meets them, they may have heard this exchange. It doesn't say, but we assume that they must have. Well, let's continue the story as we see Jesus then getting to Bethany finally, getting to, Mary, and getting to the situation where he's going to restore the life back to Lazarus again. Verse 28 through verse 37. And when she had said these things, she went her way and secretly called Mary her sister, saying, the teacher has come and he is calling for you. As soon as she heard that, she arose quickly and came to him. Now Jesus had not come into the town, but was in the place where Martha met him. Then the Jews who were with her in the house and comforting her, when they saw that Mary rose up quickly and went out, followed her, saying, she is going to the tomb to weep there. Then when Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. And he said, where have you laid him? They said unto him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him? And some of them said, could not this man have opened the eyes, who opened the eyes of the blind, have also kept this man from dying? And so we see that the Jews that had come to comfort Mary and Martha over the death of their brother, obviously to be involved, to try to comfort them in whatever method whatever they could, followed Mary after Martha arrived and said, Jesus is coming. This is where I met him. Mary goes out. The Jews that were there, the mourners that were there to comfort her, followed her out, assuming that she was going to the gravesite, going to where Lazarus was buried. Of course, she was going to see the Lord. And her reaction, of course, while it's similar to Martha's, I think it does reflect her unique personality that we saw at the earlier situation where she sat at the feet of Jesus. It was Mary who anointed Jesus' feet with oil and dried wiped the oil, the perfume off of Jesus' feet with her hair. And certainly an act of great devotion, of great homage and reverence. And we see that when she first arrives to where Jesus is, she falls down at his feet and worships him. And again, says the same thing. Jesus, if you had been here, Lazarus would not have died. And so their faith that Jesus had the ability to prevent the death, and the Jews that were with Mary said, this is the man who healed opened the blind man's eyes. This is the man, they may have heard the story of the paralyzed man from Sunday night. They probably heard of it. Couldn't he have been here and saved Lazarus' life? And of course, we know that was part of his plan. And so the question, there's been a lot of statement about verse 35, and of course it's, I don't watch much NFL football any longer. A couple years ago, they kind of soured me on some of their shenanigans. But used to be in many football stadiums, right inside the goalpost, there would be somebody holding up a sign that said what? John 3:16, okay, for God so loved the world. But there was also, they would hold up the John 11:35 occasionally, which is said to be what? Shortest verse in the New Testament. Well, Ed and Bob probably, could say, well, that's really not the case as far as the Greek language goes, because there's a Greek verse in 1 Thessalonians that has, I think it's 14 letters. This one has 16 letters in the Greek alphabet. But then I understand there's one that has 12. It really doesn't say anything. It's just like 3 words that really has no meaning. But the statement that Jesus wept, there's lots of questions about why, and I've heard whole sermons on that one verse. Why did Jesus cry? Why did he weep? Was it because Lazarus had died? Lazarus was somebody he loved. Absolutely. Was he sorrowful about that? Was he sorrowful because Mary and Martha, the sympathy he had for Mary and Martha, and for the mourners, the Jewish mourners that were there to comfort them? Was it because of their unbelief? There's just all kinds of possibilities about why Jesus would weep at this particular time. Because he knew what was going to come next. He knew what was getting ready to happen. Jesus didn't have any problem about, knowing that Lazarus is going to be walking around here again just a very little bit. And yet we see that Jesus showed compassion for probably sort of the whole 9 yards. I mean, it's very difficult sometimes, even if we're not close to individuals, when they suffer a death in the family or a loss, to be around them, to try and comfort them, knowing that there's really not much you can do. I go back to the case of Job. When Job loses 10 children on the same day, and his 3 friends come and try to, for the first 7 days, they just sat there with Job and said nothing. Because how do you, it'd be bad enough to have 1 child die, but can you imagine having 10 die on the same day? besides being wiped out financially, having a vast fortune gone. But we know that whatever the situation, Jesus showed compassion for for Mary and Martha at this event. And so Jesus then says, "Where have you laid him?" Where's he at? Okay? And moves on to, well, as it might be called, the main event. The reason why Jesus came, the reason why Jesus delayed coming to Bethany, he wanted to make sure that he was dead, and they knew he was dead. There wasn't going to be any question about, well, the stories about Jesus on the cross. Well, there was a theory that, well, he just swooned. He was just unconscious. He really wasn't dead, when Jesus was crucified. Jesus wanted to make absolutely sure that there wasn't any question about the fact that Lazarus was dead. And of course, we know from that he had been dead for 4 days. He had been in the tomb for 4 days, and we see that as we go on. So let's pick up with verse 38 and read down through about 45 probably, 43 anyway, somewhere in there. Then Jesus, again groaning in himself, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone laid against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone, Martha," the sister of him who was dead, and said to him, "Lord, by this time there is a stench, for he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not say to you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God?" Then they took away the stone from the place where the dead man was laying. Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. And I know that you always hear me, but because of the people who are standing by, I say this, that they may believe that you sent me." Now when he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth." And he who had died came out bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Loose him and let him go." And so we see Jesus praying to the Father, acknowledging that God heard him when he prayed. And of course, that's an important point, because we know just in a matter of a few, probably less than a couple weeks, maybe 2 or 3 weeks, Jesus is going to pray in the garden for himself. He's going to petition God on his own behalf, that the cup that he was going to have to suffer, the crucifixion, the dying on the cross for my sins and for your sins, and for the sins of Adam at the beginning of time, and for the last Adam at the end of time, whenever that's going to be. Jesus was going to have to bear all of those sins on that cross. And God heard him, but of course that was the only way. That was the way that had been chosen from before the world. And that was what was going to happen. But Jesus prayed that, you've always heard me, and I know you know what I'm going to ask. But so these that are around me and hear this and see this, can believe that you sent me. So there was a purpose, again, behind this entire scenario of Lazarus getting sick, of Lazarus dying, and Jesus knowing that he was going to raise him from the dead. Now, again, the science behind dying is, I've stood at the operating table of people who have died, loved ones who have died. There's really no physical change that we see, as far as, and there have even been investigations to see if they can measure the weight of the soul by putting somebody who is near death on a very sensitive table that would measure the weight, and at the time of death, to see if the weight drops as the soul leaves the body. It doesn't. There's no, the soul, whatever, its component makeup, whatever it is not something that's physical. It's not something that has, height, depth, and weight, and things like that. It's not a physical existence. But when a cell, and of course a human body is made up of 100 trillion cells, with massively complex systems involved with biochemistry. I wore my deoxyribose nucleic acid tie tonight. That's the DNA. I wore that because very shortly after the ending of the biochemical processes that we call life, the DNA starts to come undone. It starts to break down. The bonds that hold the sugars and the phosphates and the nucleic acids together, the adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine, they start to come apart. And this was what was happening in Lazarus. During those 4 days he was in the tomb. Now, one of the commentators made the statement, and I can't back this up. I've not been able to dig deep enough yet to get confirmation that many times the Jews would reopen the grave after 3 days to make sure that the swoon theory, they hadn't just passed out. They had, or their heart rate slowed way down or nearly stopped. They wanted to make sure they were dead. Now, again, we don't really get that evidence. We know that Martha obviously knew that if they opened that tomb, if they opened that grave, that the biochemical processes of decomposition, since the life processes had stopped, okay, the immunology of the body is no longer fighting off bacteria that are commonly present in the body, and the body has started to deteriorate. Every cell has stopped functioning. There's no heartbeat. There's no release of carbon dioxide, no need for oxygen anymore, so no breathing. And all of these things, of course, Jesus restarted with the words, "Lazarus, come forth." So, that by itself is amazing that, that those processes could be started. But then again, stop and think about what Jesus did at the creation. When he took a rib, Jesus carried on the first surgery. When he took a rib out of Adam and formed woman from the dust of the earth. Of course, he took Adam from the dust of the earth, made Adam from the dust of the earth. And so when we look at the scientific miracle behind what Jesus did with Lazarus, like I said, it's sort of mind-blowing to me, because I've had the opportunity, and some people don't think it's all that big of an opportunity, to work with lots of dead people. When I worked in the physician's assistance program at Alderson-Baptist University, I had 12 cadavers that I was in charge of, and we taught human anatomy using those 12 dead bodies, those individuals who had donated their bodies to science. And you think, well, that's pretty ghoulish a job, but for somebody that's taught human anatomy for 30 plus years, that is the pinnacle of the way to study what is going on and what structures, the marvelous structures that we find in the human body that God has created. And so, to have, to imagine that, one of those 12 bodies, of course, those had been dead for years and years and years in some cases, could be brought back to life, but Jesus had that ability. When you can take dirt, dust, and make a human body out of it, you have power. You have real power. You have power that's beyond even any comprehension that we have of power. So to be able to restart, the cellular functions, to reorganize the DNA and each one of the 100 trillion cells in Lazarus's body, to have the heart start beating, and of course we think, okay, that's not that big a deal anymore, because there have been cases where people have been hours without a heartbeat under very unique conditions. If they've drowned in fresh water, especially very cold fresh water, the body can be, the heart can be restarted. And they can, ask Jason back there, I'm sure Jason could easily tell us that is a possibility. You don't, give up, especially if the water's been very cold, because it slows all the biochemistry. The demands for oxygen slows it way down. But certainly we know that, Martha was very familiar with what happened when people died, because, and especially in that part of the world, probably early spring, starting to get warm, and even at 53, 54, 55 degrees, whatever the ground temperature would be in a tomb, he was starting to decompose. He was clearly dead, and Jesus, of course, brought it all back, brought all of the organization in the body of Lazarus back to a situation where he could live again. Now, of course, we know, as I said earlier in the week, that Jesus used the death of Lazarus and the raising of Lazarus to teach a very important lesson, to fortify the faith of Mary and Martha, to fortify the faith of his disciples, to fortify the faith of the Jews who saw it, and to teach everyone, the Jews at the time, not that all of them believed it, well, they knew Lazarus was dead because they wanted to kill him again. They wanted to get rid of it. They had to get rid of the evidence, and we see that as chapter 11 continues. So let's go ahead and read from 45 through the end of the chapter because I'm running out of time. But you can't give me 5 now. I need more time than that. Verse 45 through the end of the chapter. Then many of the Jews who came to Mary and had seen the things Jesus did believed in him. But some of them went away to the Pharisees. The snitches were out. Went away to the Pharisees and told them the things that Jesus did. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered a council and said, "What shall we do? For this man works many signs. If we let him alone like this, everyone will believe in him. And the Jews and the Romans will come and take away both our place and the nation." And one of them, Caiaphas, being high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and that not that the whole nation should perish." Now this he did not say of his own authority, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not only for that nation, but also that he would gather together in one the children of God who were scattered abroad. Then from that day on they plotted to put him to death. Therefore Jesus no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went from there into the country near the wilderness to the city of Ephraim, and there remained with his disciples. And the Passover of the Jews was near, and many went up from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. Then they sought Jesus and spoke among themselves as they stood in the temple, "What do you think, that he will not come to the feast?" Now both the chief priests and the Pharisees had given a command that if anyone knew where he was, he should report it, that they might seize him. And then down in verse 9 of chapter 12, we see the plot against Lazarus' life. Lazarus is now up walking, talking about living his life. Then a great many of the Jews knew that he was there, and they came not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. But the chief priests took counsel that they might also put Lazarus to death, because on account of him many of the Jews went away and believed in Jesus. The raising of Lazarus fortified the faith of Mary and Martha, fortified the faith of Jews. They believed that Jesus was the Son of God. They believed that he had power of the resurrection of the dead. We know that Mary and Martha and now his disciples are beginning to get the idea that he will raise everyone from the dead, that everyone will in that last day be resurrected from the dead to stand in judgment for what we have done in this life. And we certainly see that the restoration of Lazarus from the dead teaches us tremendous lessons about so much. But it should fortify our faith. It should help us to realize that it's only because of Jesus going to the cross. Thursday night, we cover the resurrection of Jesus, which of course gives us that hope. It's through that cross, the right cross that Jesus died on and shed his blood, that we can have that blessed assurance that we have a hope of a resurrection with him if we've been faithful. Well, Chris, I think did I get close to your 5 minutes? That was 8, he says. Thank you for your attention this evening. Tomorrow evening, we'll be looking at the story of the restoration of Saul. And, many of our friends, I'm sure I'm supposed to give you the verses. Acts chapter 9, verses 1 through 22 is the major part of the story, this conversion of Saul. And certainly there's important lessons, and invite your friends and family, because how many people do you know say, well, if you invite me, I'd come, but if I came to church, I'm such a bad person. The things I've done are so bad, the building would fall down on me. Well, we need to understand that Jesus converted a murderer. And so we'll look at that tomorrow evening. Thank you for your attention this evening.